Prime Minister Narendra Modi strongly condemned on Thursday the recent terror attacks in France, including the heinous attack inside a church in Nice, where a woman was beheaded and 2 others killed in a church within 2 weeks of a teacher being decapitated in Paris. The Prime Minister also asserted that India stands with France in the fight against terrorism. Meanwhile, political leaders of other democratic countries like Pakistan's Imran Khan, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Malaysia's Mahathir Mohamad have taken a diametrically opposite position to India's. New Delhi on Wednesday had strongly deplored the personal attacks against French President Emmanuel Macron following his tough stance on radicalism, calling it a violation of the most basic standards of international discourse. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the situation in France, liberty, and our fight against terrorism. Joining me on the program today are Kanchan Gupta, senior journalist, Shakti Sinha, foreign affairs analyst, and Elizabeth Braw, strategic analyst. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Shakti Sinha, I'd like to start the program with you first. Let's analyze and understand your thoughts on everything that has happened in France.
I mean, what has happened in France is terrible. It's a direct attack on human dignity, on freedom. You may not like something. You may find that your religion or your beliefs are being insulted. There are ways to handle it. Violence is clearly not one of them, particularly when probably you don't even know what is happening. And the worst thing which is happening is that if you listen to actual President Macron's speech, it is a very nice speech. He explains, he goes into the background of the colonial experience, of the fact that these people have come, the fact that the French society has not been very successful at managing them. So it's a very honest admission, and yet he rightly upholds that the French Republic is based on certain principles, certain values, where freedom of expression is very, very important. And since the French Republic came with the fight against the church, the Catholic Church, and the first step was taking away the schools from the church and making them secular. So that is the bedrock of the French Republic. If I live in France, I may have my personal views, which I should, but I cannot challenge the very foundation and expect to be part of it and challenge it in this brutal manner. Unfortunately, a lot of people outside France have justified it in their own way. No, but therefore, I don't think so. Any but therefore should come into the picture. The incident of the teacher, the terrible beheading, and this one in the church, I think this is terrible. It's a blot on human society, and anybody who can justify it, I think, needs their head examined. Worse, probably worse.
Elizabeth Braw, let me bring you to the picture now. So concepts like freedom and liberty, are they being misused in democracies? Because we've seen that these same countries a few years ago took in migrants by the loads, welcomed them all with open arms, but now they seem to be paying the brunt of it.
Well, that is a tragedy, and I completely agree with what was just said. It's deplorable, but what do we do about it? And I think there can't be anything more cowardly and more vicious than killing little old ladies, slitting their throats while they are praying in a house of worship. I mean, who would think to do that? But yet it's happening, and the question is, I think in liberal democracies all over the world, what are the rules we set for our communal lives, considering that we now accommodate a wide range of people of different beliefs and of different ethnicities and of different religions? And I think that the mistake maybe that has been made, and maybe especially since the refugee crisis, is that we haven't set the parameters for what we expect of everybody wishing to live in our societies. We have expected that they will come by osmosis, that once you live in France, once you live in Germany, once you live in Sweden, you somehow automatically adjust. Well, I don't think we can expect that to happen. It does happen in many cases, and many people do adjust and become very valuable members of society, but many do not, and they abuse the hospitality granted to them by these liberal democracies. I think we have to be much better at setting the rules about what we expect if you're going to live in our countries.
Okay, setting the rules, setting guidelines is a good way, is what Elizabeth Braw is suggesting. Kanchan Gupta, let me bring you into the picture now. So Do you believe that that is the best way forward, really, as far as dealing with radicalism is concerned? Setting some kind of rules, setting some kind of order in place, and then proceeding?
Well, I mean, rules exist. I mean, laws exist. But what the experience in France, the recent incidents in France have shown, is that there is a conflict between the idea of democracy and the concept of theocracy. And so long as this conflict remains, there will be continued expressions of violence. It's not only in France. We have seen similar incidents in India. And I do not want to go into specific incidents, but there have been several incidents in India where there has been similar retribution, and more recently in Uttar Pradesh. But somehow we have not woken up to the reality of the threat that looms. And this threat is only going to get worse by the day. Europe never quite figured out the future challenges of immigration. There was legitimate immigration, there was illegitimate immigration. And in both cases, Europe believed that their liberal democracies would overwhelm the political and other views of the freshly arrived immigrants. And that actually didn't happen. And that was perhaps never destined to happen. And this is not the first time, this is not the first incident in Europe that is of such a vicious nature. We have seen similar incidents in Amsterdam, where a filmmaker was killed, and he was killed in a public square. We have seen similar incidents in England. We have seen similar incidents in many Scandinavian countries. And now it's happening in France. It's happened earlier also in France when there were these repeated terrorist strikes. So this is, in a sense, I don't wish to sound rude, but Europe, in a sense, is paying for its inability to estimate the threat which would be posed by immigrants at some point of time. And to an extent, there's a lesson in that for India.
Right. So lessons need to be drawn as far as what's happening in Europe, and India should be prepared to, is what the panelists are suggesting. Now, let me take the discussion forward and broaden the scope of this discussion a little bit. Shakti Sinha, what's even worse is the kind of statements that have come through from world leaders.
Yeah.
Some nations that call themselves democracies haven't condemned what has happened in France. What do you have to say about that? Why do you think it is so?
I mean, you're absolutely. I mean, in fact, I didn't mention it first time because you had. I mean, Erdogan's statements are, okay, you are trying to become the Sultan of the new Ottoman Empire. You want to be the alternate leader of the Muslim Ummah. Fine, that's your internal fight within the Ummah. I believe it at that. But to encourage violence and to say that this is that Macron should go and get himself mentally checked up and that we'll boycott friend goods. Imran Khan, I don't take seriously because Imran Khan is a yes man of anybody. He is a full-time yes man of the Pakistani army. He is a part-time yes man of Xi Jinping. And now that he's found Mahathir Mohamad, he's happy to be his yes man also. But Mahathir himself is a problematic figure. He's out of power. He has lost his job as prime minister. Mahathir likes to be provocative, but this time to say that millions, he's not said that, okay, you've killed, okay, you've taken revenge, which is bad enough. This is worse than bad, okay, I'll leave it at that. But to say that millions of French should be killed for what they have done in the past. I mean, if this is the kind of world you are looking at, then you should remember that the things can flow both ways. I mean, I'm not suggesting it. I hope it does not happen. None of us want violence. We absolutely condemn violence in the strongest terms. But if countries who live in the international community with each other, have minorities, and whose own people are minorities in other countries, if you are not sensitive to the fact that there will be differences of opinion, yes, you think insulting is bad, those people allow insulting, there are ways to deal with it. One, don't see the cartoons. Don't read an offending book. Nobody's forcing you to read a book. Nobody's forcing you to see the Charlie Hebdo cartoon. Don't see it. In fact, this teacher in class in France told, yes, I'm doing this to show how strongly we value freedom of expression, despite the killing of the Charlie Hebdo case. And he said, those who are uncomfortable, please do not look at it. If you're still not comfortable, please sit outside the classroom also, which is fine. Understanding that it's a nuanced thing. But if the reaction to that is not just violence, but justification by leaders of the violence, then I think the international community should not just sit back, but rally, support what French are doing. Because if they don't do it, tomorrow it's your turn. So I think that is a lesson that all of us need to learn, that there should be absolutely zero tolerance for this kind of horrible, completely horrible behavior.
Since we are here, then Elizabeth Braw, what options does the international community have? I mean, how do you respond to something like this? How do you insulate yourself from such attacks?
I think that's what lots of leaders are trying to figure out. But it's clear that the tradition of condemning violence and expressing thoughts and prayers with the victims and their families in the country, that's not enough anymore. And it's what happens every single time, and when world leaders come together and say we deplore this violence. But what does it mean if there are no consequences? And I'm not saying that we have done too little in the past. It's just that the violence seems to be increasing, or the hatred against Western lifestyles seems to be increasing. And we should remember that just a couple of weeks ago, possibly, two Germans were stabbed. Well, one was stabbed to death, one survived, unfortunately, by a Syrian asylum seeker who had already been in trouble with the authorities and would have been deported, but Syria was not deemed a safe country, so he was allowed to stay in Germany. And then he went on to stab these two German gentlemen. And it's just an example of maybe where we need to be tougher and not just deplore violence, but consider maybe deporting those who abuse the hospitality. Yeah. And it's obviously we should be hospitable as safe and liberal countries, but we shouldn't be hospitable to those who abuse the hospitality. And then, unfortunately, I think in that case, if you stab somebody to death, it's the human rights of the people in the country that you wish to live in, I think are as important as your human rights, and then you have really forfeited the chance of living in that country, and you should be sent back.
Right. Kanchan Gupta, absolutely. I think these kind of measures do need to be taken. And since we are here, what do you think that, like-minded countries should do? Also, just to add to that particular question, did you expect this kind of a backlash, that we've seen over the last few weeks?
Before I go into that, I would just like to add to what one of my co-panelists just now said about deporting those who violate the host country's laws and rules and way of life. Now, that's easier said than done, because Europe itself is guilty of creating a superstructure that gets to decide who gets to live and who doesn't get to live in Europe. Every time there is a deportation, deportation is virtually impossible from Europe because of your layered system. And finally, when it goes to your European court, the European court rules against it, and that becomes the standard, and that has become the standard. There are umpteen examples of Britain trying to trying to deport people. They have failed. There are umpteen examples of Scandinavian countries trying to deport people and that having failed. So Europe really needs to look at its own structures of governance and law enforcement to get some sort of sanity back into place. Having said that, I think there is an urgent need for an international coalition of democracies which still believe in free speech in an open and plural lifestyle, which countries which believe that the answer to a book is another book, and the answer to a book is not killing the author or the publisher or bombing bookshops. The answer to a film is to create another film or not to watch that film. And this kind of a coalition is increasingly necessary, and we have seen the incipient signs of that kind of a coalition now happening. Who would have thought that India would have taken such a strong stand and expressed solidarity with France and President Macron? Because let me just remind people that in 2005, when the Danish cartoons controversy happened, the then government very abjectly called upon the government of Denmark to offer an apology, an unconditional apology. If I remember correctly, the scheduled visit of the Danish Prime Minister to India was called off, and India basically joined the global Ummah chorus of protest. So from there to here has been a long journey, and I am extremely, extremely happy to see, and I'm really grateful to the government that it has chosen to take a firm stand and send out a very strong signal. And as far as global reactions or partisan reactions are concerned, Mahathir Mohamad's reaction is not at all unexpected. He has been propping up radical Islamists. I mean, Zakir Naik, who escaped from India, found shelter with him. He gave him shelter. And there are other numerous stories that can be told. As far as Imran Khan is concerned, Shakti is right. We really don't need to take that pipsqueak seriously. And when it comes to Turkey, Turkey is at war with the whole world. And Turkey is going to come to grief because of its very rash decision to take on the entire world, and it's in fact it's at war with many Muslim countries too. So we have to see it in that context, and I don't think this time the call for a boycott of French goods is going to work, because the world is also changing, the world is reforming, and there is greater awareness happening. And coming back to, because I would rather look at things from a very Indian perspective, I think if the government of India really means business, and if it means what it has been saying on two occasions, the official statement which was issued after the Paris killing, and then the Prime Minister's statement after the Nice killings, and if the government really means those words, then the government has to start looking at cleaning up things at home. It is shocking. Let me remind you that, and let me inform your viewers that yesterday what they did was they pasted pictures of President Macron on the road at Bhendi Bazaar in Mumbai, and to ensure that people walked on them and vehicles passed over them. So this kind of a mindset exists in India too, and we really need to look very closely at it.
So India has strongly condemned the attacks on France, very strongly. The Prime Minister and even the MEA has come out with statements. How can both nations come together and fight terror? Can we expect more collaboration on this front?
Yeah, in fact, we have been collaborating over the years. It has developed. And let me, in addition to France, bring in a very critical role being played by Saudi Arabia in this, and the OIC. The Saudi, the boycott thing, they said nothing doing with the boycott of French things. The OIC, led by the Saudis, while deploring the cartoons, said it's unfair, it's insulting to Muslims, also then condemned the killing of the teacher and the violence. So, when you work with countries within the Muslim world, and both India, France, particularly have good relations with large parts of the Muslim world, I think the need for India and France to now make it very clear, working with friends like Saudi Arabia now, who realize that this violence thing cannot go on, and that the world jihad is not what is in anybody's interest. I think the need for both countries, therefore, to develop much closer relationship, sharing of intelligence, understanding how to work with radicals and therefore counter-radicalization and de-radicalization both at the same time. Those who have become radicalized have to be brought back. The radical propaganda, which Kanchan mentioned about Bhindi Bazaar, how do you counter that? I think both countries have to learn from each other's experiences because we have large number of people in our countries who do believe in different systems, who do believe that possibly rule of law is not what they want. How to deal with that? I think we have to learn from each other. But of course, particularly on the bottom line, share intelligence amongst yourselves and with others, that those who are beyond the pale, who will not come back, how do you deal with them? Do you let them fester and spread, or do you control them and bring it under control?
Absolutely. And since we are here, Elizabeth Bro, how serious are nations about fighting terrorism? I mean, when they can't define terror, how can you fight it?
That's a very good question. I think that's something that every government is struggling with. What is freedom of expression and what is terrorism, and where do you draw the line? It's clear that, you know, at one end of the spectrum, if you express your ideas, then that's freedom of speech. But if you act on them, and it's a violent act, it's terrorism. But where do you draw the line? And I think that's where we all in the West and in liberal democracies more widely have struggled. And that includes the UK, for example. The UK has given refuge to some quite radical preachers from all over the world who have, especially during previous reigns in the Middle East, were imprisoned by their rulers who were authoritarian and tried to crack down on extremism. And then these preachers, in many cases, were given refuge in the UK. It's a humanitarian act and one that should be applauded, but it has also caused trouble for the UK. And I think many people remember somebody called or nicknamed Captain Hook because he had a hook instead of a hand because his hand had been lost in some sort of accident. The UK tried for years to deport him to Jordan, and it struggled to do so because he could face potential torture in Jordan. So this is really difficult. But I think when we think of the countries that could be of help, I think Shakti Sinha just mentioned more. Well, I shouldn't say more moderate, but at least more helpful countries in the Middle East and other parts of the Muslim world could help us here. And I think it's in their interest to support the fight against radicalism. And I hope we hear more from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, even from Sudan, which has now apparently recognized Israel. I think it should stand Sudan in good stead to say something about this as well, and to say that it supports freedom for and safety for everybody. So there are a number of countries we can count on, I hope.
And since we're talking about radicalization, Kanchan Gupta, is it too late now to stop radicalization? The million-dollar question is, has the fight against radicalism only gotten tougher, and how do we put an end to it?
I don't think radicalism is something which was born day before yesterday. It was always there, and it's just that through different patches of history, it has come to the fore. If you look at West Asia's history post 1947-48, it was all about Islamic radicalism. If you look at the history of India between maybe 1725 and 1780, there was a lot of radicalism we have witnessed over here. If you look at 1825 and 1880, there was a lot of radicalism happening over